I never thought I'd see the day when a parking lot would lose a fight against a creek, but that's exactly what happened, and honestly, if you'd told me the ending before it all started, I probably would have laughed in your face. The whole thing began on a quiet Saturday morning in late spring. I was sitting on my back porch outside my house near Cedar Hollow, drinking coffee and enjoying one of those rare mornings when everything felt exactly the way it should. The birds were making enough noise to drown out the highway a few miles away. The air still had that cool dampness from overnight rain, and somewhere down in the woods behind my property, I could hear the familiar sound of water moving over rocks. That creek had been there longer than anyone in town could remember. My grandfather used to tell me stories about it when I was a kid. He bought the property back in the 1940s, and according to him, the creek was one of the main reasons he chose that land. Growing up, I spent countless summers down there catching tadpoles, turning over stones looking for crawfish, building little dams that never lasted more than an hour before the water pushed through them. It wasn't some famous river or tourist attraction. It was just a small woodland creek, but it was ours, and after my grandparents passed away, it became one of the few places that still made me feel connected to them. Around 9 that morning, I heard machinery. At first, I didn't think much about it. Logging crews occasionally worked in nearby valleys, and construction wasn't unusual either. But after about 20 minutes, the noise got louder instead of fading away. The ground almost seemed to vibrate beneath my boots. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my jacket and started walking toward the back edge of my property. The farther I went, the stranger things felt. Birds had gone silent. The usual sound of running water was gone. Even before I reached the clearing, something felt wrong. Then I stepped through the trees and just stopped. For a second, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. The creek was gone. Not partially blocked. Not temporarily diverted. Gone. In its place was a wide strip of gravel covered with fresh construction materials. Rebar poked out of the ground. Survey stakes stood in neat rows. A bulldozer sat nearby, while workers moved around preparing forms for concrete. I remember standing there thinking, maybe I was in the wrong place somehow. Maybe I'd walked farther than I realized. Maybe this was another section of land. But it wasn't. I knew every inch of those woods. The stream that had flowed there for generations had literally been buried. My stomach dropped. I started walking toward the workers, trying to keep my temper under control. A guy wearing an orange safety vest noticed me approaching and stepped forward. He looked exhausted, covered in dust, clearly just doing his job. "Morning," he said. "Can I help you?" I pointed toward the construction site. "What happened to the creek?" He glanced behind him and shrugged. "We're building an overflow parking area and walking trail." "Over a creek?" I asked. "There was a creek right there yesterday." The man wiped sweat from his forehead. HOA said this section wasn't private property. They told us it was community land. We got approved plans and everything. Community land. Those two words hit me harder than they should have, because I knew exactly where this was coming from. About 2 years earlier, a new HOA board had taken control of the neighboring development. The old board had mostly left people alone. The new board was led by a woman named Denise Holloway, and Denise loved projects. Every month there seemed to be another improvement initiative, another beautification effort, another proposal designed to make the neighborhood feel more upscale. Walking trails, decorative fencing, expanded event spaces, additional parking. She talked about growth the way some people talk about religion. The problem was that Denise had a habit of assuming things belonged to the HOA simply because she wanted them to. I looked back at the buried creek and felt anger building in my chest. "Did anyone verify ownership?" I asked. The foreman shook his head. "Not my department. We were hired to build." I couldn't even blame him. He wasn't the one who made the decision. Somebody else had. Somebody sitting comfortably in an HOA meeting had pointed at a map and decided 100 years of natural history was less important than a few extra parking spaces. I left without saying another word. The entire walk back to my house felt surreal. I kept replaying the scene in my head, hoping I'd misunderstood something. But deep down I already knew exactly what had happened. And when I got home, I went straight to the old filing cabinet my grandfather had kept for decades, because if my memory was right, the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The filing cabinet sat in the corner of my home office, the same dented metal cabinet my grandfather had used for decades. Most people probably would have thrown it away years ago, but he was the kind of man who never got rid of records. Every property document, survey map, tax receipt, and county notice ended up in that cabinet. Growing up, I used to joke that if civilization ever collapsed, Grandpa could rebuild the county government from those folders alone. That afternoon, I spent nearly 3 hours digging through drawers until I found exactly what I was looking for. The original survey. The paper itself was yellow with age, but the lines were still clear. There it was, marked plainly across the map, Cedar Run Creek. Not only was the creek identified, but a protected watershed buffer extended 15 feet on either side. I sat there staring at it for several seconds before pulling out additional records. A county environmental designation from the late 1970s. A stream preservation notice from the early 1990s. A land use review from years before the subdivision even existed. Every document said the same thing. The creek was protected. Any alteration required county approval. Any construction inside the buffer zone required environmental review. Suddenly my anger transformed into something else. Confidence. Because this wasn't a disagreement over property lines anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding between neighbors. This was a violation. A serious one. I called my friend Ethan Mercer first. Ethan worked as a civil engineer for a neighboring county and understood land regulations better than anyone I knew. After listening to my explanation, he was quiet for several seconds. Then he laughed. "Tell me you're kidding." "I wish I was. They paved over a protected stream?" "Looks like it. Without permits?" "As far as I can tell." Ethan let out a low whistle. "Jake, if what you're saying is accurate, somebody's about to have a very bad month." That was the first moment I realized how much trouble the HOA might actually be in. The rest of the weekend became a full-scale evidence-gathering operation. I photographed everything. The buried creek bed, the gravel, the construction equipment, the survey stakes, the disturbed banks, the piles of displaced rock. I even pulled older photos from my phone showing the creek flowing naturally only a few weeks earlier. By Sunday night, I had assembled a report thick enough to make an attorney smile. Monday morning, I sent copies to the County Water Management Office, Environmental Compliance Division, Planning Department, and Construction Permitting Office. Then I waited. The funny thing about bureaucracy is that people think it moves slowly until the right department discovers somebody broke the wrong rule. 5 days later, I got my answer. I was standing in my driveway when 3 county vehicles rolled past my house and headed toward the construction site. By lunchtime, there were 6 vehicles. By mid-afternoon, the project had been shut down completely. The next day, I drove down there just to see for myself. Construction equipment sat idle. Orange notices had been attached to temporary fencing. Inspectors walked around taking measurements and photographs. The atmosphere looked completely different from the confidence I'd seen a week earlier. Workers stood around talking quietly. Nobody seemed happy. Then I spotted Denise. Even from a distance, I could recognize her. She was standing beside 2 county officials gesturing wildly while holding a stack of papers. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read body language. Denise looked furious. The inspectors looked unimpressed. A few days later, the official notices became public record. Illegal stream alteration, unpermitted construction, watershed buffer destruction, environmental compliance violations, stop work orders, potential restoration requirements. The list seemed endless. Some neighbors celebrated. Others complained that I had overreacted. One resident actually stopped me at the grocery store and said, "Couldn't you have worked this out privately?" I looked at him and asked a simple question. "How exactly do you privately unbury a creek?" He didn't have an answer. What surprised me most was how aggressively the HOA tried to shift blame. At the next community meeting, Denise claimed the board had relied on outdated maps. Then she suggested contractors misunderstood instructions. Later, she implied county records were unclear. Every explanation somehow avoided one uncomfortable fact. Nobody had checked before they started bulldozing a protected waterway. Meanwhile, nature was beginning to create its own problems. Summer storms arrived early that year. The first heavy rain revealed something interesting. Water doesn't care about meeting minutes. Water doesn't care about HOA votes. Water doesn't care about development plans. It simply goes where physics tells it to go. Since the creek had been buried, runoff started collecting in strange places. Small puddles appeared after storms, then larger ones. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy rainfall, I walked down to inspect the area. The sight almost made me laugh. The brand new parking lot sat in the lowest section of the entire project. Water had pooled across portions of the fresh pavement. Not enough to cause major damage yet, but enough to reveal a problem. The natural drainage path had been interrupted. I called Ethan again. After looking at photographs, he started laughing before I even finished explaining. They built the lot right on top of the drainage corridor, didn't they? Looks that way. That's incredible. Not in a good way. No, he said. In a very expensive way. Over the next several weeks, county investigators completed their review. The deeper they looked, the worse things became. Historical maps confirmed the creek's location. Environmental records confirmed protection status. Previous aerial photographs showed decades of uninterrupted water flow. There was no gray area, no loophole, no ambiguity. The creek had always been there. Then one evening while reviewing documents online, I noticed something that changed everything. Buried inside the county findings was language discussing full environmental restoration. Not mitigation, not partial correction, full restoration. I read that phrase 3 times. Full restoration meant returning the creek to its original condition. Original condition meant original path. An original path happened to run directly through the center of the HOA's brand new parking lot. I remember sitting back in my chair and smiling for the first time since this whole mess began. The next morning, I contacted the county restoration coordinator. We had a long conversation about stream recovery, watershed protection, and ecological repair. Near the end of the call, I asked one simple question. If the creek is restored, does it return to its historic channel? There was a brief pause. Then he answered, legally, that's usually the preferred outcome. That answer stayed with me all day, because suddenly I could see exactly where this story was headed. The HOA thought the worst part was over. They thought the fines were the punishment. They thought stopping construction was the consequence. What they didn't realize was that the real bill hadn't arrived yet. And over the following weeks, as county engineers finalized restoration plans, the future of that parking lot became very clear. The creek wasn't merely coming back. It was coming back exactly where it belonged, and there wasn't a single thing Denise Holloway or the HOA could do to stop it. 2 months later, the restoration crews arrived. I happened to be drinking coffee on my porch when the first excavator rolled down the access road. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the same type of machinery that had destroyed the creek was now being brought in to save it. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By lunchtime, people were gathering near the site, watching from a distance as county contractors marked the original channel using historical surveys and engineering maps. Then the work began. Huge sections of asphalt were cut apart and hauled away. Gravel disappeared by the truckload. Drainage pipes that had been installed only weeks earlier were ripped out of the ground. Every improvement the HOA had proudly announced was systematically erased. I stood there one afternoon watching an excavator peel back a section of pavement that sat directly over the old stream bed, and I couldn't help remembering the day I first discovered the creek buried beneath that same spot. The difference was that this time I wasn't angry. I was fascinated. Nature was getting a second chance. Denise showed up several times during the restoration. The first visit was memorable. She marched across the work zone carrying a folder full of paperwork and demanded to speak with the project supervisor. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. This parking area cost thousands of dollars, she said. The supervisor barely looked up from his clipboard. The county ordered full restoration. There has to be another solution. There was, he replied. Not paving over the creek in the first place. A few nearby residents actually laughed. Denise didn't stay long after that. Week by week, the transformation continued. The original channel was excavated. Native stone was brought in. Stream banks were rebuilt. Biologists supervised vegetation planting. Hundreds of native grasses, shrubs, and young trees were installed throughout the corridor. What had been a sterile construction site slowly started looking alive again. Then came the rain. Real rain. A powerful storm rolled through one evening in early fall. Thunder rattled the windows. Wind pushed sheets of water across the valley. I sat on my porch longer than I probably should have, watching the clouds move through. The next morning I walked down to the creek before sunrise. The air smelled fresh. Water rushed through the restored channel exactly as it had for generations. Sunlight filtered through the trees and reflected off the moving current. Small pools had already formed along the bends. Birds were back. Frogs were back. Even the sound felt familiar, like something lost had finally returned home. I followed the stream downstream until I reached the section where the parking lot used to be. That's when I stopped and smiled. because technically speaking, the parking lot was still there, at least part of it. But now it sat beneath water. The lowest section had become a permanent wetland retention area connected directly to the restored creek. Native vegetation was already taking hold. What had once been rows of planned parking spaces was now habitat. The irony was almost too perfect. The HOA had wanted more room for residents to park during events. Instead, they had created a protected environmental zone where construction would never be allowed again. Over the following months, the financial consequences became public. Restoration costs exceeded expectations. Environmental penalties piled up. Legal expenses grew. By the time everything was finished, estimates placed the total damage well above $50,000. Some residents were furious with the board. Others demanded resignations. A few longtime homeowners told me privately that they had warned Denise against rushing the project. Apparently, she had ignored them. Eventually, several board members stepped down. Denise lost her position not long after. The parking lot never returned. Today, if you visit that section of the property, you'd never know there was once an ambitious development project there. You'll see a healthy creek winding through the woods. You'll see native plants growing along protected banks. You'll hear water moving over rocks exactly the way I heard it when I was a kid. And whenever the HOA hosts community events now, residents park along the main road and walk the rest of the way. Every single time they do, they pass the restored creek. Sometimes I wonder whether Denise ever walks by it. Sometimes I wonder if she realizes the entire situation could have been avoided with one phone call, one survey review, one moment of patience. Then again, maybe that's the lesson. A lot of people think power means being able to change whatever stands in your way. But some things aren't obstacles. Some things are there for a reason. History, property rights, nature itself. Ignore them long enough, and eventually they remind you who's really in charge. As for me, I still visit the creek from time to time. I bring a cup of coffee, sit on an old fallen log, and listen to the water. It sounds exactly like it did when my grandfather was alive. And honestly, that's worth more than any parking lot could ever be. So here's my question for you. Did I do the right thing by pushing for full restoration, knowing it would completely destroy the HOA's project and cost them tens of thousands of dollars? Or should I have accepted the fines and let them keep part of the development? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next unbelievable true-style community karma story.